If HR were an animal, what would it be? And before you answer, ask yourself why. Because the animal you choose probably says less about HR and far more about what you believe leadership should look like. That's exactly where one beautifully designed lion took me. And by the end of this episode, I'm not sure you'll see leadership or that lion in quite the same way again. Welcome to Hard at Work with me, Trina Sunday. This space is for HR leaders who care deeply about performance and equally deeply about people. For more than 25 years, I've been asking one persistent question. What are the real conditions for happiness at work? Because when humans come first, something deeper shifts. How people show up, how leaders decide, and how work feels. Here, we explore what it really takes to lead with courage, compassion, and clarity, and we pull up a chair to the conversations HR leaders don't always get to have. There's heart here, but there's also depth. If you're ready to build workplaces where people and performance thrive side by side, you're in the right place. Let's get to the heart of it. Have you ever had one of those moments where something stopped you mid-scroll? Not because it was outrageous, not because somebody posted yet another LinkedIn humble brag disguised as vulnerability, and not because you're looking for something in particular, quite the opposite. You weren't looking for anything at all. Then something quietly catches your attention. That happened to me a few weeks ago. I was scrolling through LinkedIn when I came across Ari's campaign for this year's national convention. And if you haven't seen it, let me paint the picture. Because honestly, it's stunning. The background is drenched in deep crimson reds and rich burgundy tones. And emerging from the centre is this magnificent lion. Not a wildlife photograph, but a beautifully stylised interpretation. AI on steroids, and it's stunning. The mane explodes into fiery oranges, golds, reds, almost like paint suspended in midair if you're looking at it on the website. The whole image feels alive, confident, bold, powerful. Doesn't simply sit on the page, like it owns it. And across the bottom sits one word: raw. And underneath, I am HR, hear me roar. My first thought was, wow, not because of the message or the artwork. Whoever designed it nailed the brief. It's memorable, cinematic, impossible to ignore. If the exact image had been promoting a wildlife documentary, I'd have loved it. And if it had been advertising an exhibition at the WA Museum, I'd probably have shared it. If National Geographic had released it, I'd be showing it to everyone I know. It's creative beauty. But after admiring the lion for a few moments, something shifted, not dramatically, but just quietly. And it was almost as though my eyes and my instincts had very different conclusions. Part of me was thinking, this is brilliant. And another part was saying, why is this making me so uncomfortable? I know me. So I know over the years I've learned about myself that the reaction, if it feels slightly bigger than what is warranted, I generally pay attention, because usually it isn't about the thing, right? It's about what sits underneath it. So I got curious, and over the next few days, that line just kept coming into my head. I'd be walking the dog, making a coffee, driving between meetings, working with clients. Completely uninvited, back would come the lion. The question wasn't, do I like the lion? I do. The lion isn't the problem. The artwork isn't the problem. The question that kept nudging me was much simpler. Why, of all the qualities HR could aspire to, were we being invited to roar? Not lead, not influence, not connect, not redesign, not listen, not build, not transform. It was the verb. Hear me roar. And I couldn't stop asking myself, is that really what I want HR to become famous for? And this isn't an episode about criticising Ari, far from it. I actually think they've achieved exactly what the marketing set out to do. I'm talking about it. You're now thinking about it. You're probably going to go check it out, see what I'm banging on about. You're welcome, Ari. The line isn't my issue. The campaign isn't my issue. It's not even about the marketing. It's about our identity. When did we decide that the future of HR should be louder? When did executive presence quietly become associated with volume? When did courage become something that needed to roar? The funny thing is, once I started to ask that question, I couldn't stop seeing it. It's like buying a red car, right? Before you buy one, you don't notice it. Then suddenly every second car on the road is red. The lion became my red forerunner back in the day. Everywhere I looked, leadership seemed to be borrowing the same language. The same symbols, the same metaphors. Like, when did leadership become a nature documentary? Everywhere I look, leadership seems to be speaking the same language, and we've normalized the words. We hunt opportunities, we capture market share, we crush targets, we execute strategy, we dominate markets, we attack problems head on, we eliminate competitors, we win the war for talent. Honestly, if David Attenborough narrated most executive meetings, would it sound that unusual? Here, we observe the senior executive defending territory during the quarterly budget review. Notice the confident display of dominance as the chief financial officer circles the spreadsheet. Like, honestly, once that image entered my head, I couldn't stop laughing because suddenly it felt slightly absurd, just like my impersonations. Not wrong, just strange. Then I started thinking about animals themselves: lions, wolves, sharks, eagles, tigers. Every airport bookshop seemed to have at least one of them staring back at me from the leadership section when I just got back from Queensland. Apparently, if you want to become a better leader, the first step is choosing your favourite predator. And that made me wonder, why predators? Of all the things, extraordinary things that nature has to teach us, why do we keep returning to the creatures at the very top of the food chain? I'm not suggesting these animals are not remarkable. They are. They're extraordinary. I've swum with great whites. They are extraordinary. Nature is full of astonishing examples of courage, instinct, adaptability, survival, right? So it's not about criticising lions, but why are we so fascinated with what they represent? Because I don't think the animal is really the metaphor. Power is. Dominance is. Control is. Certainty is. The lion simply becomes the visual shorthand. And once I saw that, I found myself asking, oh my gosh, have we become so used to equating leadership with dominance that we no longer notice that we're doing it? Because that's the funny thing about metaphors. We often think they're decorative, a clever way of an idea being more memorable. But they're much more powerful than that. They quietly teach us what success is supposed to look like. So if HR leadership especially is constantly described through the language of predators, then without anybody saying it explicitly, we begin to associate good leadership with qualities predators possess: strength, presence, fearlessness, control, being at the top, winning. And none of those things are inherently bad. In fact, many of them matter. But leadership absolutely requires courage. Sometimes someone has to make a difficult call. Sometimes we have to stand in front of a room and just say, this isn't acceptable. Sometimes leadership requires enormous conviction. I'm not questioning courage. I'm questioning whether courage always needs to look the same. Because with over 25 years working with leaders, I have met people, and I've shared this before, who can command a room without even trying to dominate it. I've watched CEOs ask one thoughtful question that's changed the entire direction of a conversation. No dramatic speech or table pounding or performance. Just, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? And suddenly everyone stopped defending positions and started solving problems. I've watched executives apologise, like properly apologise. Not one of those beautifully crafted corporate apologies. I'm sorry if anyone felt upset. No, I mean the real ones. I got that wrong. I didn't listen. Help me understand what I missed. Every single time when that happened, respect didn't diminish, it grew. Because people don't only admire confidence and courage, they admire humility, integrity, curiosity, wisdom. And the security to admit that you don't know everything. So that's when another thing crept in. Perhaps we've accidentally confused confidence with leadership. Or maybe more dangerously, we've confused dominance with influence. They are not the same, not even close. I've met incredibly dominant leaders with no influence whatsoever. People complied, they certainly didn't trust them. And I've met remarkably quiet leaders who possess a presence that transforms organisations, not because they speak the most, but because when they did speak, people knew it mattered. Compliance comes from power. Influence comes from trust. They're built very differently. Which brought me back, once again, to that campaign. Because the more I reflected on it, the clearer something became. My discomfort wasn't really the lion, right? It wasn't even the predator metaphor, really. It's the bit that came next. Hear me roar. And I just kept turning those words over in my head. Like, what does roar actually mean? Like, not metaphorically, like literally. I even found myself looking it up and nerding out on it. Because honestly, I thought there might be another definition that I'd forgotten. Perhaps it meant conviction or wisdom or influence or courageous leadership. It didn't. A roar is a loud cry, a sound to establish presence, to warn, to intimidate, to announce yourself. And I remember sitting there thinking, well, that's interesting. Because when I think about the finest HR leaders I've ever worked with, I never once thought, you know what made them exceptional? They really knew how to roar. What I remember is something completely different. You know, that person that quietly noticed everything that everyone else missed. The HR director who asked the one question that changed the board discussion. The people and culture leader who challenged the CEO. Not loudly, but courageously, because the proposed decision would have harmed people. The exec who can hold tension without rushing to certainty. The leader who made people feel safe to tell the truth. None of that feels like roaring. It feels like something else. And that's what I realised what's been bothering me all week. So I had to do a podcast episode about it. We've spent decades helping HR earn credibility, earn influence, earn a place at the executive table. Or if you're in my world, be so good at your job that people will pull up a seat at your table. But somewhere along the way, I wonder if we've quietly started believing that influence only comes when we become louder, when we sound more certain, we project more confidence, when we become more lion-like. And I simply do not believe that that's where the future of our profession lies. Because if I had to choose between someone who could roar and someone who could design a broken system, I'd choose the second person every single day. Which is where my brain went next. Not toward another leadership theory or a management book, towards a beaver. I know, hear me out. So there I was, perfectly sensible HR consultant, walking the dog, thinking about whether HR should roar. And somewhere between the park and home, my brain wandered to one of those places it has a habit of visiting. I started wondering, what if we'd chosen different teachers? Not leadership gurus, different parts of nature. Because this isn't just about animals, it's about our imagination, right? Every metaphor shines a light on something, but it also casts a shadow. And when we choose the lion, we naturally notice courage, power, presence, strength. When we choose a shark, we might notice relentless movement, power. When we choose a wolf, we notice hierarchy in a pack. Every metaphor quietly teaches us what to value, right? So what if we started somewhere else? What might I have learnt instead? And somehow the first creature that came into my head was a beaver. I know, what the actual. They're not even a thing in Australia. But a platypus just wasn't cutting it. Sorry, platypus. Beavers. Not exactly the image you'd expect to find on the cover of Harvard Business Review. I've certainly never attended a leadership conference where a keynote speaker walked confidently onto the stage and announced, "Today I'd like to help you unleash your inner beaver." Although I'd probably attend that keynote, to be honest, mostly out of curiosity. But here's the fascinating thing about beavers. They don't dominate ecosystems. They redesign them. They don't fight the river. They don't overpower it. They don't roar at it until it changes direction. They quietly alter the conditions. One branch, one stick, one carefully placed piece at a time. And eventually, the water begins to flow differently. It changes the landscape, which creates wetlands, which creates habitats, which attracts birds, fish, insects, plants. Hundreds of other diverse species benefit because one beaver quietly changed the environment. Not by becoming louder, by becoming a designer. And I found myself smiling as I walked home because that feels remarkably familiar. The finest HR leaders I've worked alongside have never spent their careers fixing people. They've spent their careers redesigning systems, broken systems. They ask different questions. Not why aren't our people more resilient, but why have we designed a workplace that demands so much resilience? Not how do we coach managers to have better conversations, but why have we built a culture where difficult conversations are avoided until they become crises? Not how do we improve well-being, but what is it about the way we've designed work that's making our people unwell? They are profoundly different conversations. It's less about repairing people and more about redesigning environments. That's Beaver work. Quiet, patient, mostly invisible, transformational. And you've got to laugh, right? Because nobody's ever described that work by saying, hear me roar. And then my brain goes somewhere else, as it does, elephants. I've spent time with them in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand, fighting for their rights in Cambodia, and most recently, visiting rescued elephants living their best sanctuary life in Phuket. I have always loved elephants, but not because they're the biggest or the strongest. There's just something wonderfully comfortable about them, to me anyway. Maybe that's my time spent in Africa. But they never seem to be trying terribly hard to convince everyone that they're elephants. They simply are. There's an ease about them, a confidence that doesn't seem to require performance, and perhaps that's why I find them so compelling. The matriarch doesn't lead because she's the loudest. She doesn't lead because she's the most intimidating. She doesn't establish authority through spectacle. She leads because she remembers. She remembers where the water is when everything else is dried up. She remembers which paths are safe. She remembers what happened last time the herd faced something similar. She carries memory, perspective, wisdom. Her authority is not built on domination. It's built on stewardship. And I found myself wondering, when did leadership become more impressed by certainty than wisdom? Because they're not the same thing. Certainty says, follow me, I know. Wisdom says, I've seen something like this before, let's think carefully. One performs confidence, the other creates confidence in everyone else. One needs attention, the other earns trust. Again, not much roaring. And then, because apparently my brain's decided it's now in a wildlife documentary, I found myself thinking about forests. Not trees, forests. That's an important difference. We love celebrating exceptional individuals. The standout performer, the visionary CEO, the brightest star, the tallest poppy. Except in Australia, we cut those down. Everything in leadership seems to revolve around finding the remarkable individual. Nature doesn't seem nearly as interested. A healthy forest isn't healthy because one tree is extraordinary. In fact, if only one tree is thriving, you've probably got a problem. What makes a forest remarkable isn't the individual trees, it's the relationships between them. Scientists now know that there's this extraordinary underground fungal network connecting tree after tree after tree. Nutrients move where they're needed, warnings travel through the system, older trees support younger ones. The forest survives because everything is connected. Mind-blowing. Because organisations aren't collections of brilliant individuals. They're networks of relationships. Trust lives between people. Culture lives between people. Learning lives between people. Innovation lives between people. Leadership lives between people. Not inside one charismatic individual. And suddenly the lion feels different again, right? Because I think that's what's bothered me all along. A roar is, by its very nature, individual. It's one voice announcing itself, one presence establishing itself, one creature saying, notice me. But the healthiest organisations I've ever worked with aren't built around one voice. They're built around hundreds, sometimes thousands. People who feel safe enough to contribute, safe enough to disagree, safe enough to challenge, safe enough to ask, what if we're wrong? That's not what roaring creates. Like, roaring creates attention. Listening creates contribution. And contribution changes organisations. So by now, I realise we're not really comparing animals anymore. I'm comparing philosophies. And one philosophy says leadership belongs to the strongest individual. The other says leadership exists to create the conditions where everyone else can thrive. One celebrates the hero, the other designs the ecosystem. One asks, how do I become more powerful? The other asks, how do I make this system healthier? And I know which question feels more like HR to me. Not because HR should stay in its lane, quite the opposite. Because HR has quietly been holding one of leadership's greatest insights for decades. People don't experience strategy. They experience systems. They experience their manager, their workload, their role clarity, their team, their meetings, their flexibility, their psychological safety. Their ability to speak honestly without wondering whether honesty will cost them. That's where the work becomes real, not in the strategic plan or the org chart or the beautifully designed conference campaign. It's in the lived experience of Monday mornings. And perhaps why the phrase, hear me roar, kept catching my mind. Because I'd never been asked to describe the very best leaders I've known using the word roar. I'd probably use words like notice, connect, translate, question, protect, design, steward, humanize, but none of those make particularly exciting convention slogans. I get it. I started my career in marketing in the late 90s and I've done my work in that space. But we've been searching for inspiration in the wrong part of nature because maybe the future of leadership doesn't belong to the loudest creature in the jungle. Maybe it belongs to the people quietly redesigning the jungle itself. And if that's true, then I started wondering something even bigger. HR hasn't been trying to become more influential because we've lost our way. Maybe we've been trying to survive in someone else's. HR hasn't always been invited into the conversations that mattered. Like for decades, we've lived with the stereotypes, right? HR isn't commercial, HR doesn't understand the business, HR just organises events, HR slows everything down. And if you've worked in this profession for any length of time, you've heard them all. And some of us have spent our entire careers trying to prove them wrong. I know I have. I've sat in boardrooms where people's decisions were treated as an afterthought. I've watched organisations spend millions actually, on strategy while giving almost no thought to whether people could actually deliver it. And I've seen commercial decisions become cultural disasters because nobody stopped to ask one simple question. What is this going to feel like for the people expected to live through it? That's not a HR question. That is a business question. We've simply been the people asking it. So when our profession began talking about earning a seat at the exec table, I understood exactly why. I still do. But that conversation's never been about status, right? It's about influence. And our people decisions deserve to sit alongside financial decisions, operational decisions, technology decisions, strategic decisions. Not because HR is more important, but because people are central to every one of those decisions. And that's a fight worth having. I'm doing it every blessed day. But our conversation needs to mature. HR quite rightly challenged ourselves to become more commercially credible. We've got work to do. Yes, we might read balance sheets, we might understand business models, and we talk about productivity, risk, growth, technology, the customer experience, markets. Again, all those things, tick, tick, tick. And I've been encouraging HR leaders to do exactly that for years through my coaching work. But commercial credibility isn't the enemy of human-first leadership. It's what gives human leadership influence. I still believe that. I see it every day. But somewhere along the way, the conversation stopped being about expanding our capability, and slowly it's about changing our identity, changing the brand, the label, the line metaphor, without changing what's in the jar or what we do or how we show up. It's a very different thing. Learning the language of a business is one thing. Trying to become the kind of leader the business already admires, though, that's another. Do we really want to be another lion trying to force our way into the pride? There's dynamics there that would make that highly unlikely. But our language did start to change. we start talking about ourselves as using executive presence or having executive presence, commanding the room, owning the conversation, projecting confidence, projecting certainty, developing our gravitas, being more visible, being bold. Again, none of those qualities are bad. Confidence matters, presence matters, courage matters. The question's not whether they're important. The question is what it looks like. Because somewhere along the way, I think executive presence becomes confused with executive performance. Almost as though influence belonged to the person who spoke first, or longest, or loudest. If you can command attention, people will assume you're influential. But I've never found that to be true of people that are just loud and raw. I've worked with those people. I've worked with those leaders, and I know you have too, that dominate every single meeting. They left everyone exhausted, not inspired, not wiser, just exhausted. I've also worked with the leaders who barely spoke for 40 minutes, then asked one question, not even the cleverest question, but the clearest one. And it cuts through the bullshit, and suddenly the entire conversation changed. Those leaders didn't command attention by roaring to be noticed. They commanded thought. And there's a profound difference. One performs leadership, the other creates it. Humans are the most phenomenal species in nature. And the best HR leaders, they notice the human things. I've started wondering whether perspective is the one thing that HR has consistently undervalued about ourselves. Finance sees the numbers, operations sees delivery, technology sees systems, marketing sees customers, legal sees risk. HR sees relationships. We see how decisions travel. We see where trust grows and where it breaks. Like we see how one seemingly sensible exec decision quietly ripples through an organisation for years. We see the unintended consequences before they appear on a dashboard. It's not soft. It's systems thinking. And perhaps that's the capability organisations need more than ever. Because look at the problems that leaders are wrestling with now. Artificial intelligence, hybrid work, burnout, polarisation. Oh my gosh, polarisation. Skill shortages, rapid technological change. None of those challenges are solved by one charismatic leader having all the answers and roaring about it. In fact, the more complex the problem, the less useful certainty becomes. Because these aren't technical problems, they're adaptive ones. They demand curiosity, experimentation, collective intelligence, the courage to say, I don't know yet. That's not weakness. It's leadership suited to complexity. And that's where it all clicks for me, right? Perhaps we've spent years helping HR to become better at playing yesterday's leadership game, where our real opportunity is far more ambitious than that. HR isn't here to master the existing model of leadership. We're here to challenge it, or we should be. Not because leadership's failed, well, maybe, but because work has changed. The old model was built for certainty, hierarchy, control, predictability. Today's organisations need something completely different. Connection, adaptability, learning, judgment, discerning judgment. Hello, AI, lacking your discerning judgment. Humans need to do that. That incredible species in nature, only we can do that. The ability to hold commercial outcomes and human outcomes in the same conversation. And if that's true, then perhaps the greatest contribution HR can make is not becoming louder. It's helping leadership evolve. And maybe if that was the master plan, the campaign would make perfect sense. Not because I agree with it, but because I finally understood it. Maybe. Like, hear me roar isn't a new story, right? It's a logical conclusion that everyone's been building, a story that says that influence belongs to the loudest voice, that credibility comes from looking like traditional leaders, that respect's earned by becoming impossible to ignore. I understand why we've told ourselves that story, but I am no longer convinced that it's the one we need. Because if the future belongs to organisations that can learn faster, adapt faster, and think better together, then perhaps our profession doesn't need to become more like yesterday's leaders. Perhaps leadership itself needs to become a little more like HR. Here's something for you. Maybe the raw isn't about aggression at all. Maybe it's about exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly having to prove your value. And honestly, I get that. I've lived that. And I imagine that most HR people listening have lived that too. So perhaps we've looked at that line and thought, finally, someone's telling the world that we're strong. Finally, somebody's telling people to listen. And I understand that could feel good. I really do. But what if we've become so focused on finally being heard that we've stopped asking whether we're trying to sound like the right thing? We've stopped asking the right questions. Whose problem are we actually solving? Who carries the unintended consequences of this? Have we confused speed with progress, and will people trust us after this? Those aren't roaring questions, they're redesign questions. But somewhere between that lion, that beaver, and an embarrassing long internal conversation while I was walking my dog, the question changed. Because when I think about organisations I've admired most, they're not full of leaders trying to become influential. They're full of leaders trying to build organisations that depend on influence in the first place. The best organisations I've worked with don't rely on one heroic executive making brilliant decisions. They create environments where good decisions happen consistently, where people speak up before problems become the crises, where disagreement isn't dangerous, where learning travels faster than the hierarchy. Where trust isn't something that the CEO talks about once a year. It's something people experience every Tuesday. That's not heroic leadership, that's design. It's good leadership by design, not by default. And perhaps that's the word that I've been searching for this entire episode. It's not power, design. Not louder leaders, better designed organisations. And I know which one feels more like the HR I want to be involved in. And it's also why I never thought of my heart work model as a framework, because frameworks tell people what to do. Heart work is asking people what they're assuming. It's creating the space to redesign the environment. It's not built around the tools. It's built around the questions we can ask if we have those pillars in place. Like what have we normalised that no longer serves people? What are we rewarding without even realising it? Have we mistaken resilience for redesign? And are we confusing activity with progress? Are we asking people to adapt to systems that should have been redesigned years ago? Those aren't HR questions, they're leadership questions, or at least they should be. Because here's where I've landed, right? HR was never supposed to become another version of leadership. Our role is to help leadership evolve, to keep asking the questions that complexity demands, to remind organisations that commercial success and human experience were never competing priorities. Our people and performance should thrive side by side. They're inseparable. Every strategy, every restructure, every tech implementation, every cost-cutting decision eventually lands in somebody's life. Somebody has to keep bringing leaders back to that truth. That's not soft. That's governance, that's strategy, that's leadership. Which brings me back one last time to the line, because perhaps the real question was never whether HR should roar. To me, the real question, and for me, I faced it personally in trying to figure out what the hell my legacy is going to be. But what do we want to become famous for? Being louder or helping organisations think better? Being more visible or building workplaces where people can do the best work of their lives? Winning attention or redesigning the conditions that make people and performance thrive together? For me, the answer is clear. I don't want HR to become known as a profession that learned to roar. I want us to become known as the profession that had the courage to redesign work. Because if we can do that, we won't just change HR. We'll change leadership itself. And I think that's a story worth telling. That's heart work. Before you go, you've just spent a whole heap of time humouring me about my questioning of a lion, defending a beaver, admiring an elephant, and somehow turning a conference campaign into a philosophy of leadership. Thank you for indulging me. And if you're wondering, no, the next intake of my Game Changer HR Leader program won't involve 10 weeks deciding which animal you are, creating your own leadership habitat, or curating the perfect zoo experience. Although, now that I've said that, I'm slightly disappointed that's not the design. What we will spend 10 weeks doing is something far more valuable. We're going to challenge assumptions that shape the way we lead in HR. We'll explore what it means to build commercial credibility without losing our humanity, and we'll develop the confidence, clarity, and strategic influence to redesign work, not just respond to it. Because that's what Heart Work is all about. It's not another framework, it's a different way of thinking about HR leadership. So if this episode resonated with you, if it challenged you, or if you're simply ready to lead HR a little more courageously without roaring, I'd love to continue the conversation. The next intake launches soon, and we keep it small and intimate so we can get the most out of it, and I'd love for you to join us. You can find me on LinkedIn, through the website at trinasunday.com, or across all the usual social channels at Trina Sunday Official. Until next time, thanks for spending time with me. If this conversation challenged you, clarified something, or simply reminded you that you're not the only one holding the tension between people and performance, then it's done exactly what it was meant to. This work isn't easy, but it is necessary. HR has a new future, and it leads with heart. So if you found value here, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Share this episode with someone who also believes that work can be better. And if you want to go deeper, you can explore the Heart Work model, the programs, and the growing community of HR leaders at trinasunday.com. Because when HR leads with clarity, courage, and compassion, it doesn't just change workplaces, it changes lives. Until next time, keep asking better questions, keep backing your voice, and keep putting humanity at the center of performance. Let's keep heart at work.